Today, our message is entitled Praying with the Covenant. Praying with the Covenant. And today's passage came from 1 Samuel 1 through 13. And we're introduced to Samuel's mother. Her name is Hannah. But before we get there, wanted to kind of address some things that a lot of people kind of go through. Some people think it'll be easier to worship if there are no problems in life. I mean, wouldn't that be great? If there's no problems in life. A lot of times we think that problems are the reason why we can't worship, or problems are the reason why we can't catch a break. A lot of times problems, they do that. But we don't have to remain in these things. But so many times we become stuck in it, right? We become stuck in the problem, where that is the center of attention, where that problem is the main show, right? To the point where we feel stuck. We feel as if we can't do anything. We get stuck to the past. We get stuck to the present, right? To the point where we can't see any future. The thing is, if we get stuck in our problems, we just naturally lag behind. And we lag behind this culture, lag behind a lot of things that are happening around us here in this United States of America, to the point where we have nothing to offer. We have nothing to, nothing in the tank to help anybody. When you lag behind the age, you lose, right? When you fall behind what is needed for the world around us, we get left behind with everybody else's problems as well. And it's not to say that problems that you're facing are insignificant. They are significant. That's why they are bothersome. That's why they, really come into your mind even when you're not around the problem physically. But what we see here today is when we're focused on the covenant, we're able to advance beyond any problem. And a great witness of this is actually Abraham. Abraham had a lot of issues. He was in a land filled with idolatry. And on top of that, he was childless. He didn't have an heir to give all his possessions or to continue his family line. He had nothing really. And so, especially in this culture, that was such an important factor. But yet God gave him this covenant of Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. Let's read this together. Ready, go. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So through this covenant, God gives Abraham a future. Before transit was created, before there was a knowledge of nations beyond your neighbors, God gave Abraham this blessing, that you will be a blessing to all the families on the earth. And through this covenant, Abraham was ahead of a lot of the powerful nations that existed during that time, that age. He was able to go ahead of a lot of the culture that existed during his time, because he saw God's calling. He saw God's call for him to not only, just me and my own should be blessed, to seeing beyond that for all nations, for all the families of the earth to be blessed. That's why God was going to bless him. And this is what we see today with Hannah. And this is the picture that we'll get. But it all starts with a problem, right? Verses 3 through 8, we see a problem. Elkanah had 2 wives. Hannah was barren. And some theologians will say Elkanah had 2 wives because Hannah was his first wife, but could not bear children. So that's why he took on the second wife. Because in this culture, it was important to have heirs. So Hannah was unable to, so he took on Peninnah, right? Sounds like something you get from Panera, right? Peninnah. And she was a firecracker, right? Where Peninnah provoked Hannah grievously to irritate her. Have you had anybody like that in your life? Where they're not just there to nitpick at you, but they do it so much to the point of just breaking you. And don't look at your don't look at your parents, guys. Hannah's situation was very, very heartbreaking because she felt so alone, right? She was given a double portion. When they went up to go sacrifice, to give worship to God, they would get a piece of their sacrifice that was given to eat. And Hannah was given a double portion, the best parts of it, but times 2, while everybody had, their single portions. But she couldn't eat it because she was so upset. Though she had the support of a loving husband who said, "Isn't my love greater than 10 sons?" He couldn't understand what she was going through. And that wasn't enough to overcome her sadness. Imagine her state of mind, right? Imagine what's going through her mind, her heart, what's going through her spiritually, where she's being made fun of, right? In her own home, where she's looked down upon by not only this competing wife, but also the children of, right? It's like a mini hell on earth. That's what she was living. But despite what she was going through, something changes as she kind of thinks through her situation, where her prayers start to change, where Hannah changed the focus of her problems from her own to actually what God desired. Don't get me wrong, her prayer request was the same, exactly the same. I want a son. However, her reason completely changed. What she was focused on completely changed. Instead of receiving this answer to overcome her rival, she saw the bigger prayer request to raise up a Nazarene. And this Nazarene, this kind of vow, so there's a thing called the Nazarite vow. And it was a vow that was made to set people apart for the Lord. So there were certain requirements that they had to keep. They weren't to cut their hair or their beard. They're not to drink of wine. And there's a couple of other things that are attached to their calling, including not touching dead bodies and things like that. But what was more important was these people that take this Nazarite vow would be set apart to be spiritual leaders. And this is what the problem was. Israel was going through a lot of problems. During this time, the priest that was, at the temple, his name was Eli. And Eli had 2 sons. We saw their names, Hophni and Phinehas. And they were evil. They would sleep with the women that were working at the temple. They would eat the fatty portions that were actually dedicated only to God, and they ate it themselves. Even Eli participated in that because he was actually a very fat man. Later on, we see how he dies, and it's due to kind of his own weight coming upon himself, and he passes away due to that. But that was all due to him taking with his sons the fat portions that are actually dedicated to the Lord. What Hannah saw was a bigger picture. A bigger picture of the spiritual state of Israel. And this came about because she held on to this one thing, and that's the covenant. She made this Nazirite vow to set her son Samuel apart for the purpose of the Lord. If you had a long-awaited child, right, that you've been waiting for because you've been barren, you don't just give that child away to the Lord. You take hold of that child and you parade him, right? You say, look, I got my son now. He's better than all your children. You can imagine, what would you do if you had one up against your rival or someone that has been constantly just badgering you? Maybe you do it like a humble brag, you know? But whatever it may be, you know, it's just, that's where your heart would be. My son, me, mine. And it would be thought of as, yeah, that's right. That's rightful that you do that, actually. You should do that. But Hannah doesn't do that. She says, this son is dedicated to you, God. I will shave his head. So that's the beginning of a Nazirite vow. You would shave their head, and then from that point on, they don't cut their hair. In verse 11, that's what it says. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life. No razor shall touch his head. There are some vows in the New Testament where they would do that. They would cut their hair. But in this case, for a Nazirite vow, no razor would touch his head. And this would set him apart. And Hannah follows through with what she promised God. This covenant to set her son as a leader, a spiritual leader that is needed for Israel. Because that's what was needed. Israel needed a spiritual leader. Instead of being left behind in her problems, Hannah was able to see what God desired. In this case, someone that could take Israel, right, and lead them spiritually. And what was crazy is that Hannah was ahead of even the leaders of Israel. This mom, this barren woman. In light of the entire society, she was kind of a nobody, right? She was somebody's wife that couldn't bear children. That's who she was. But because she held on to this covenant that God is with her, right? And that this Nazirite vow that she would vow to give this child for the sake of the Lord. She was ahead of her time. She was ahead of what was needed. She got ahead of the leaders to provide Israel what they actually need. And we're going to see what God does with Samuel. Samuel was a prophet of God, where not one of his words fell to the ground, meaning that everything that Samuel spoke of actually took place because it was so tied to the Lord. And this very covenant, this pathway of making this kind of promise, this vow, is also given to us as children of God because it's tied to Jesus Christ, who is our covenant. Where there is no way to God, he became the way. Where there is no answer to sin, he became the solution through the cross, taking our unrighteousness and giving us his righteousness. so that we can stand before God as someone that can enter heaven. And he is the King of Kings who has conquered Satan. And the works that we see almost on a daily basis, right? These evils that we see on the news, these evils that we see or hear about through YouTube, TikTok, everywhere. Through Jesus, he is the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and he transcends all these things. And it's about us aligning our hearts to his covenant, to who he is. So our conclusion here today is this: let's limit our concentration to the covenant. Because a lot of times we put all of our concentration only on the problem, and the covenant is kind of in our periphery or even behind us. It's like, when things get better, then I'll come back to this. But what I'm saying is flip it. Let our concentration be on the covenant. I'm not saying ignore your problems. That's also a problem, right? Don't ignore your problems, but don't make it the main show. Come back to the covenant and see what God is planning. That way, you start to select what is really needed. And what is needed can save the future. Sounds kind of far-fetched, but that's what we see with Hannah. She saved the future. Israel was doomed to constant captivity, constant slavery, but it was through the prophet Samuel that they would overcome the Philistines who constantly badgered them, who constantly took them as captives, constantly harassing them. And not one word fell where everything came to completion, because what Samuel held on to was so connected with God's heart. And he changed the course of Israel. Eventually, he set the first king, Saul, and then he set the next king, King David, who would take over Saul's kingship. And it comes down to being one with God, oneness. And as we are one with God in terms of knowing his heart, right? We're so good at telling God what's on our mind, what's on our hearts. That's good. Keep that going. But we need to know God's heart. And it comes by us holding on to the word again. Holding on to the word that we received through our Sunday message, through our Sunday pulpit. And the words that you read throughout the week in your Bible, having that time to read is so important. Because then we're able to see purpose, even in the midst of problems. Sometimes it's harder to see, depending on what the problem is. But nonetheless, when we focus on what God desires, the problem that we're currently facing or what we're facing in the near future or what have you, it doesn't have to be a problem. It could be, like I said, a new change, right? A new semester, a new something. Whatever it is, we start to see a purpose behind it. And that's what we need today. So that we're not just left behind in our problems. We're not left behind in this age of a lot of problems, but we're able to stand in front. We're able to lead. Even if it's a small type of lead, whether it's just within our family, whether it's just within our church, that's where we begin. And God will connect the dots to whom God needs us to be connected to. And let's read through kind of the rest of what happens with Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 12 through 18. So let's read what takes place after. Let's read together. Ready, go. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. Therefore, Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, "How long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you." But Hannah answered, "No, my lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation." Then Eli answered, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him." And she said, "Let your servant find favor in your eyes." Then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Amen. We see the transformation that takes place. Even in this quick moment of prayer, her countenance changes from one who was depressed, anxious, sad, unable to eat, to one who is no longer sad and was able to eat. It was sad that Eli saw her as a drunken woman because guess what? That's who his sons hung out with, right? And they would bring all that junk into the temple. That's how bad the spiritual condition of Israel was, or even their spiritual leaders were a mess. And so we see Hannah saying, "No, I'm not a drunk woman. I'm not a worthless woman. I'm just someone that is just a lot on her heart, a lot on her mind." And then Eli thankfully blesses her. And then as she finishes praying, God gives her that kind of assurance because of what she's holding on to now. It's not getting back, but rather seeing what God desires and what God needed for that age. Because overall, all this blessing is for this purpose, this goal of salvation, right? And not salvation in the ways that is very religious, but salvation in the means of actually saving a nation. They were constantly getting pummeled by these idolatrous nations when they had the one true God. And Samuel saves Israel as he takes leadership as he grows up. And we're going to kind of go through that as well to kind of see what Hannah sowed and what was reaped. And I think that's something that we have to see through these witnesses of the Old Testament so that we too can be witnesses today. Because that's what is needed today, are people that have real answers. People that are concentrating not on the wrong things, because everybody else is doing that. The whole world is doing that. But concentrating on what God desires and seeing how he uses our, very small lives. Just like Hannah, she was one of the wives of Elkanah and she was barren. That's her identity. That's who she was. But she was used to make huge changes to the history of Israel. The same God that worked through Hannah is the same God that works through you today. And this is where we can begin, by refocusing, reconcentrating on what is needed to be focused on and concentrated on. Limiting our concentration not onto all the problems of the world, but putting those things in our periphery, right? Don't just ignore him, but putting our sights on what God desires first, and then seeing what needs to be selected, right? So that we can really be used to build the future that is needed.